It was a thick, foggy night, the kind that wraps around you and muffles the sounds of the city. Valentina was breathing hard as she ran down the narrow alley, her heels clicking loudly on the wet pavement. She was like a predator in the dark, her heart pounding with the thrill of the chase, not with fear. She wasn't running, she was leading him right where she wanted to go. Every twist and turn through the labyrinth and the streets was calculated. Her sharp mind was always 3 steps ahead. Damon was no fool, though. She could feel him closing the distance. His presence was like a shadow that wouldn't go away. There were neon lights and dark corners in every direction. The city was like a maze of perfect predation. Valentina could feel her heart pounding with excitement. She loved moments like this, when the stakes were high and the outcome was far from certain. With each step she took closer to the place she had chosen, she felt more excited. She picked this spot for their meeting because it's hidden away from prying eyes. It's a place where they can talk things out in private. As she rounded the corner, she came to a stop in a narrow dead-end alley. The walls were close, and the room type was perfect. She turned to face the entrance, her chest. For a moment, everything was still, and then he came into view, emerging from the shadows with the confident, predatory grace of a man who knew he was in control. Damon was tall and broad-shouldered, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her feel a little nervous. His voice was low, a whisper that broke the silence. "You know you can't run from me," she said, smiling back at him. Her smile was sharp and knowing, as if to say, "I was running away." He moved closer, his actions slow and deliberate, until there was little space between them. Valentina didn't back down. She held her ground, chin up in defiance. Damon's hand suddenly reached out and grabbed her wrist with a firmness that sent a jolt through her. She didn't blink, holding his gaze. "You've led me on quite the chase," he said, his hand tightening on her wrist. "But it ends here." "Here it is," she said, challenging him with every word. He responded immediately and forcefully, grabbing her shoulders and slamming her back against the wall of the alley. There was no room for gentleness or time for anything but raw desire. His mouth crashed down on hers. Valentina responded right away, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as their bodies pressed together. His hands were firm against her body, every touch demanding and possessive, pulling up her skirt as his fingers slid beneath her with an urgency that took her breath away. Valentina moaned into his mouth, lost in the passion of their kiss. There was no room for hesitation, no time to think of anything but the intense desire that seemed to consume them both. He lifted her up with a quick, decisive movement, his hands firmly grasping her thighs and pinning her against the wall. The rough surface pressed into her back, but only added to the sensation. He was hard against her, his body demanding as he thrust into her with a force that took her breath away. There was no slow build-up, no gentle pace. Damien set a fast pace from the start, his hips slamming into hers in a rhythm that left room for nothing but physical need. The alley was filled with the sounds of their bodies moving together, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, his hands on her body. Valentina dug her nails into his back, and the roughness of their touch sent ripples down her spine. The world around them faded, and so did the heat between them. The relentless push and pull between them was all there was, and it got intense until it was too much. It was almost too much to bear. Damon gave one final powerful thrust, and Valentina came undone. Her body convulsed around him, and the pleasure was so intense it bordered on pain. Damon followed a moment later, releasing in a rush that left her trembling for a moment. They stood breathing hard, and the raw energy between them slowly dissipated. Damien loosened his grip on her, keeping his hands on her hips as he pulled back. Valentina's legs felt weak, but she steadied herself, catching her breath, still in ragged gasps, and adjusting her clothing. The game continued. The morning sun was streaming through the kitchen window, filling the compact, tidy room with a warm glow. Valentina got things done quickly and efficiently, her hands comfortably reaching for everything as she prepared breakfast for her family, freshly brewed coffee, and the sizzling smell of bacon. The comforting smell was a stark contrast to the steel cold and Ali's darkness from last night. Valentina glanced at the time, just over 7 a.m. She had plenty of time to plan before she had to start her day job, working remotely for a foreign company, which required her to be available from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. This matched most of her clients' business hours around the world, which made it easy to play her dangerous game with Damien. One night a week, instead of going to the office, the kids spilled into the kitchen, groggy-eyed but ready for breakfast. She smiled at them, she had a genuine smile that seemed to hold the secrets of the night. They sat down at the table and chatted about the day ahead. As she put plates in front of them, she knew exactly how they liked their pancakes, eggs, and bacon. Her husband came in next, freshly showered and ready for work. He gave her a pat on the cheek. Valentina had it all figured out. During the day, she was the loving wife and mother to her family. At night, she was a different person. She was very involved in her children's lives, packing their lunches and putting little notes of love in their school bags. She had been doing this since they were much younger. Even now that they were older, she liked to remind them that she was thinking of them. She walked them to the door and waved them off to school. When her phone buzzed in her pocket, she quickly checked her messages. There was just one from Damien. She didn't respond and turned back to the kitchen to clean up the breakfast dishes. Her mind was racing. Tonight wasn't a work night. It was a chase night. She had planned this schedule so that once a week she could have this rush of excitement without raising an eyebrow. Her husband thought she was working late, and the kids thought she was on the computer dealing with clients. No one asked her anything. Later, as the day wore on, Valentina sat at her laptop. The light from her screen reflected in her eyes as she pretended to be sending emails. In reality, though, her mind wasn't focused on the task at hand. She was thinking about the night falling, about how the other ladies would be waiting. She felt a rush of anticipation, but she knew she couldn't hesitate. She was in control. In her personal life and when she went out at night, the hours just kept on ticking. It was time to start preparing dinner. She had moved from her desk to the kitchen, where she held the chopping knife with the same dexterity as she would a keyboard. Her husband came home, and they ate dinner. Valentina was the picture of domesticity, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Damien was still watching her. She'd kissed her husband goodbye, told him she had a late meeting, and gone back to her office. The door clicked shut behind her. Tonight, her heart beat faster with every word she typed into the reply. The hunt was on. No one would guess that the woman who'd just wished her children a wonderful evening, who'd carefully selected enchanting books and entertaining cartoons for them, was about to step into the shadows again. Once again, everything was on track, and she was determined to keep it that way. Tonight's chase was different. It was longer and more unpredictable. Damon paced the streets, growing more and more frustrated with each passing minute. Valentina had upped the ante, leaving him with more challenging clues to find and decipher. A smear of lipstick on a wall, the torn edge of a scarf fluttering in the breeze, each clue was like a breadcrumb, leading him deeper into the city's labyrinth. But there weren't many, so he had to backtrack, rethink, and reevaluate. She was testing his patience tonight, and he could feel it. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a faint mark on a brick wall, a barely visible lipstick stain in the dim light. The last traces of her scent lingered in the air. She was close, but the trail was elusive, and he hated the idea that she might slip away. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the hunter, always in control, but tonight Valentina was making him work for it, pushing him to the edge of his abilities. The city's labyrinth of alleys and dead ends was her domain, and she ruled it with an iron fist. Damon was getting frustrated. It was like she was leading him in circles, and each clue she left behind was a taunt. He found a torn piece of cloth on a fence as he stalked, and it seemed to mock him. She was playing with him, and he couldn't accept the idea of not finding her or having to wait another week for their next encounter. His pace picked up, and he was breathing heavily, his anger rising. Valentina knew exactly how to get under his skin, and tonight she did it with expert precision. Damon was trying to think ahead to see what she would do next. She was close, but always just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like water the longer the chase dragged on. Then he finally spotted her, a flash of movement at the end of a narrow alley. Without thinking, he took off after her, forgetting all reason and strategy. His only thought was to catch her and end this maddening game before she could outmaneuver him again. As he closed the distance between them, the thrill of the chase surged through him once more, but it was tinged with something darker, something that made his blood pound in his ears. Valentina was his, and he was going to make sure she knew it. Tonight, he was going to make sure she knew it. He grabbed her by the arm and spun her around, the force of the movement sending her back into the wall, her breath taken away. Damien's eyes were wild, his excitement barely contained, before she could react. His hand came down hard, slapping her across the face. The impact was sharp, stunning her for a moment. Valentina's vision blurred, her cheek stinging from the blow. The shock of it reverberated through her, but not from pain. This was different. This was a break. An unspoken rule had been shattered. Damien's breathing was heavy, and he looked totally unrepentant. He was caught up in the moment and didn't realize what he'd done. But Valentina's mind was already racing, calculating the consequences. She knew that any mark or bruise would hint at what she was doing in the shadows, and she couldn't afford that risk. Her family and children couldn't know. Just the thought of them finding out sent a cold wave of fear through her. She pushed him away, her voice cold and final. "This was supposed to be a game," she said. "Damien, you just crossed the line." Damien blinked, and slowly, the realization of what he had done dawned on him. But Valentina gave him no time to recover. She stepped back, her gaze hard and unforgiving. "If you can't control yourself, this is the last time we play," she said, her words sharp and leaving no room for argument. She turned and walked away, the decision made. Damon watched her go. The thrill of the chase was extinguished by the cold reality of what had just happened. The game was over for now. The night fell and passed, but there was no sign of Valentina. Damien's wife? Damien waited, his usual anticipation boiling with anger with each passing hour. The city was dark and silent as ever, but the hunt needed its spark. He checked his phone over and over, but there were no messages or anything to indicate her presence anywhere. His frustration boiled over as the first light of dawn began to seep through. The next day, she tried to drown her anxiety in the routine of getting breakfast ready, getting the kids ready for school, and tending to her remote work. She knew Damon wouldn't take her absence lying down. It all started with a series of phone calls from Damon, but she ignored them. Then, there were more, each one more insistent and aggressive. She muted her phone, trying to push it out of her mind, but then the text messages started. At first, they were angry, demanding to know why she hadn't shown up. When she didn't respond, the tone changed, and the messages were threatening, each one more ominous than the last. Damon knew just what to say to get under her skin. "You think you can just walk away, but you know what will happen if you don't show up again." Her heart was racing as she read the next message. "You're not just playing with me, Val. You're putting your kids in danger, and you know you can't go to the police. They'll tear your perfect little life apart." The threat was implicit, but still there. He knew how much her family meant to her and how much she had to lose, and he was relying on that fear of exposure to keep her in line. The messages continued until it felt like the noose was tightening. Valentina was trembling as she read the messages, trying to keep her mind on work. But the phone wouldn't stop ringing, with one call after another, an unending stream of messages. Damon was losing it. His desperation was becoming an obsession. With each threat, as the reality began to sink in, he was no longer just a player in their twisted game. He was a threat to her family, everything she fought so hard to keep under control. The thought of her children being dragged into it was unbearable. The thought of her husband finding out was just too much. She knew something had to be done, but all the options were terrifying. By mid-afternoon, she had made up her mind. She couldn't go on with a constant threat hanging over her head and her family's safety hanging in the balance. Damon had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. She had to protect her family, no matter what the cost. She took a deep breath and picked up her phone. This time, there was no hesitation. She dialed the number, her mind fixed on what she had to do. Valentina sat next to her husband in the police station, the cold, sterile environment only making things more tense between them. She'd reported Damon's threats, but she was still feeling the weight of her actions. Since they got to the building, her husband had barely spoken. He looked like he was trying to control his rage, and it seemed more frightening than if he'd just let it out. The sunlight seemed too bright and harsh. He finally spoke up. "We're sending the kids to your folks. They'll be safe there." His voice was cold and final, and without waiting for her response, he walked to the car and left Valentina standing on the sidewalk. He got in, slammed the door, and drove away without looking back. Valentina stood there for a moment, feeling the sting of his abandonment. The reality of the situation was sinking in. She had been so careful and confident in her ability to balance her double life. The day went on, the house eerily quiet, her kids gone. She sat in the living room, staring at the walls, thinking about what had brought her there. The possibility of divorce was a real concern. She could lose everything, including her marriage and her children. The courts would likely see her as an unfit mother, someone who had put her family at risk for the thrill of a dangerous game. The thought of losing was unbearable. Her children were becoming more and more unbearable, and it seemed more and more likely that as the day began to fade into evening, her phone would buzz with a message from an unknown number. When it buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, but her heart also raced with excitement. She was angry. She quickly tapped out a reply, her hands shaking. "Who is this? I'm not playing cat and mouse anymore." She tossed the phone aside, trying to push away the anger and frustration. But then another message appeared: "If you change your mind, you will get the hammer." Valentina's eyes widened as she read the words. Her heart started racing, and she had a sudden realization. This wasn't Damien or anyone from that dark online site. This was something else, someone else. Her mind went back to their first anniversary, the place where they'd celebrated their love and commitment. Her husband had always been the one who enjoyed these little games and these little, intimate challenges. Her heart was racing with excitement. It had been days since she'd felt this way. She looked at the screen, her pulse quickening. It was him. Her husband was reaching out in his own way, testing her, offering a different game. She stared at the screen for a long moment, a smile slowly forming on her lips. Then, with fingers that no longer trembled, she typed back, "You'd better hide well. I've started a new game." Enjoyed today's story. Hit the like button. Share your thoughts. Don't miss out. Subscribe for a new story every day.